So let's jump in and talk about muscular dystrophies a little bit more. And again, this picture, just so you guys understand, is more of a general idea of muscle issues. But let's talk about muscular dystrophies. So we're going to talk specifically about dystrophinopathies first. And so that refers to two diseases, Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy. Dystrophin's is big transmembrane protein, and what it does, in working with a lot of other proteins as you see here in this illustration, it's this big protein that acts as a scaffolding structure. So basically, if you don't have that, the whole muscle breaks down and gets destroyed as a result of that. So the other things to know about this gene is that it's an X-linked inheritance too. It's also one of the largest proteins in genes actually in our body. Yeah. All right, so let's talk about the two different types of muscular dystrophies. So we have Duchenne. So this is, I think, maybe the one that we hear about more frequently. But you have a near loss of dystrophin protein, and you can see that in the staining here. This is supposed to be a staining for the dystrophin protein. And in this case, we have Duchenne muscular dystrophy, where there's basically none of it left. So these kids start to be affected very early on, basically at infancy. So they have delayed motor milestones. It will take them longer to start walking, longer to start standing up. They'll have other specific things you might see called a Gower sign, where if you see a video of that, you'll ask a kid, hey, lie down, and then from that position, stand up. And they can't just pop up like you and I do. They have to actually crawl up and use their hands to prop themselves up on their thighs to stand up. Most of these kids lose their ability to walk by their teens. And then in terms of life expectancy, it does get reduced. I think last I've seen it's been around the early 20s, sometimes even less than 20, depending on what you're seeing. But the biggest issues that they run into are respiratory failure and cardiac disease actually as well. That's a big one. Yeah. And then the other one is Becker muscular dystrophy. It's almost like the in-between. They don't lose all of their dystrophin, but enough where there are issues. So that happens later in adulthood, oftentimes into teens, maybe early adulthood. Most of the time, these patients are able to walk well into adulthood and live well into their 30s, probably by this point in time closer to their early 40s because of our ability to understand and work with these patients better.
I remember something like a pseudo-hypertrophy of the calf.
Yes.
Is that something
yes,
important?
Yes, that's right. I'm sorry, I totally forgot about that. So this is especially noticeable in Duchenne with these younger patients. So if you look at their calf muscles, they look huge. And you see them and you think, oh, that kid must lift weights. But because they're 5, that doesn't make sense. But when you actually look at the muscle under the microscope, you're not seeing muscle. Right. You're seeing, as you said, pseudo-hypertrophy. It's not really hypertrophic muscle. It's a lot of loss of muscle tissue, and you're going to have a lot of that connective tissue that we talked about in that last slide.
Exactly. Fibrofatty infiltration instead of muscle, which is what happens when muscle tissue is destroyed. And in the very later stages, it is called end-stage muscle, where you cannot make a diagnosis. In fact, you will be lucky to be able to identify it as muscle tissue. By the way, please note the differences between these three pictures. That's a general idea. The previous diagram that showed the huge transmembrane protein, note that it has different components, one of which is dystrophin. So depending on which genetic abnormality and what part of that protein is missing, you end up with different names. For instance, sarcoglycanopathy. So either way, whichever protein you're staining for by this immunohistochemical staining, you will identify a membranous stain normally. If it is partially absent, you will see this type of stain, and completely absent, you will see this type of stain. Here, we're talking about the most important and prevalent of these, Duchenne and Becker. Here is another, what do you think? Myopathy. Here is a fascicle. Endomysial connective tissue is increased. There is even some fatty tissue starting to appear there. There are some large hypereosinophilic fibers as well as smaller rounded atrophic fibers. They are entrapped within the scar tissue. Not much else is going on here. So this is a diagnosis that you will make after suspecting based on clinical and initial microscopic examination, and then doing this special immunohistochemical testing and possibly genetic testing.
I think it's important to note that a lot of the times nowadays we rely more on genetic testing if we're able to make a good clinical diagnosis, or at least narrow it down. And it's also important that part of my job is if I'm going to send someone for a biopsy, is to give you at least a sense of what we're looking for. Otherwise, it's a wild goose chase, and then you have a difficult job then.
Last time I counted, there were 587 disease processes, and I can't possibly go through each and every one of them
Exactly.
to work it up. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I have to give him clues, or else there's no point in sending patients for this study. The next group that we're going to talk about is going to be inflammatory myopathies. So there are really three types